On June 6, 2023, the Kakhovka Dam, well, it didn't just break. It weaponized 18 cubic kilometers of water.
Yeah, it's a volume of mass so incomprehensible that locals literally referred to the reservoir behind it as a sea.
Right, and when that infrastructure was breached, an inland tsunami was basically unleashed. It fundamentally rewrote the geography of a sovereign nation in a matter of hours.
Hours. And we're talking about over 600 square kilometers instantly submerged.
Utterly obliterated, delicate nature reserves, completely wiped out, municipal water systems entirely contaminated. The land itself was essentially conscripted into the war.
It acted like this colossal toxic sponge, just pulling up heavy metals, industrial pollutants, and thousands of lethal landmines.
Oh man, the landmines.
Right, and it flushed all of that directly into the Black Sea.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I'm your host, and with me today, we are going on a serious deep dive.
The very necessary one, because it forces us to confront a reality that goes far, far beyond industrialized violence.
Yeah. We expect destruction to come from the things we build, right? Tanks, artillery shells, drones engineered in a lab.
Exactly. But the Kakhovka breach is this agonizing demonstration of the Earth itself being grafted into a theater of war. It's a profound intergenerational catastrophe.
Which brings us to the mission of today's deep dive. We are exploring a massive, complex question that, honestly, it feels almost instinctive when you watch footage of these disasters.
It really does.
When a nation uses environmental devastation as the deliberate tactic of war, how do we pursue justice? I mean, it feels like a crime.
It feels like something that absolutely demands a gavel coming down in a courtroom somewhere.
Exactly. So today, we're going into the sources we have, examining this through two distinct but deeply intersecting frameworks.
Right. We're going to start with the secular mechanics of international criminal law, so specifically looking at the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court, the ICC.
But we won't stop there. We're going to pull the lens back and look at the transcendent framework of divine jurisprudence.
Yes, specifically diving into the biblical law of warfare to see how these actions have been categorized and, frankly, condemned for millennia.
And looking at both is just non-negotiable. If you restrict your view entirely to human legal systems, the sheer scale of the devastation just outpaces the jurisprudence.
The legal mechanisms are completely struggling to keep up. But when we look at the transcendent moral law, we find this startlingly relevant standard that addresses this exact type of destruction.
It strips away all the modern political complexities to reveal the fundamental moral rot underneath it. So let's unpack the secular side first.
Let's do it.
Because as horrifying as the Kakhovka Dam breach is, our sources outline that it is only one piece of a much larger scorched earth reality in the Ukraine-Russia war.
It's just the tip of the iceberg.
We're looking at a scale of environmental degradation that is honestly difficult to even process. Like over 30% of Ukrainian territory is currently mined.
30% of a massive European nation.
Rendered completely lethal to any biological life that steps on it. And it goes so far beyond just explosives. You have millions of hectares of what agronomists call chernozem, the famous black soil of Ukraine.
Right. This is some of the most prime, fertile agricultural land on the whole planet.
It's literally the reason Ukraine is called the breadbasket of Europe. And it is being fundamentally chemically degraded by intense, constant artillery bombardment.
And the geology of this chernozem is really essential to understand here. Because this isn't just regular dirt.
Yeah.
It is a post-glacial miracle, honestly. It's composed of this deep layer of humus, sometimes up to 1.5 meters thick, that was formed over millennia.
Just massive amounts of time.
Right. By the breakdown of loess, which is a wind-blown sediment, combined with the incredibly deep root systems of steppe grasses.
So it holds moisture perfectly.
Perfectly. It contains a highly complex microscopic biome that completely regulates nutrient cycling. So when we talk about artillery degrading the soil, we aren't just talking about the physical disruption of massive craters, though obviously that alone destroys the topsoil layering.
I was reading about the actual chemistry of these munitions in our sources. When a standard 152 millimeter artillery shell detonates, it doesn't just vaporize into thin air.
No, it leaves behind a highly localized chemical disaster.
We are talking about heavy metals like lead, cadmium, and antimony, plus all the unexploded chemical propellants, things like TNT, which is trinitrotoluene or RDX.
And the mechanism of the destruction here happens at a molecular level. Those heavy metals, the lead and the cadmium, they actually bind to the organic matrix of the chernozem.
Wait, they bind to it?
Yes. They alter the soil's pH and effectively sterilize the microbial life that makes the soil fertile in the first place.
That is wild.
So when a farmer eventually comes back, years later to plant wheat or sunflowers in that field, the root systems just absorb those heavy metals.
So the plants either die or they survive but become highly toxic.
Exactly. Toxic for human or animal consumption. And when you multiply that single artillery shell by millions of shells fired over years of this static, grinding conflict, you are engineering a complete biome collapse.
You're poisoning the food chain at its absolute foundation.
Yeah.
And then you add to that the destruction of ancient old-growth forests that take centuries to mature.
Right.
And you were looking at something that goes far beyond collateral damage, which brings up a word that advocacy groups and politicians are using increasingly these days, and that word is ecocide.
Ecocide, yes. The Stop Ecocide Foundation actually formed an independent expert panel back in 2021 to draft a legal definition for this.
And they categorized it as unlawful or wanton acts committed with the knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment.
And that carries a very intentional linguistic weight. It's placing it alongside genocide or homicide. The suffix "cide" comes from the Latin cater, meaning to kill.
It shifts the entire paradigm.
It does. It communicates that the environment isn't just the stage upon which a war is fought. The environment is a direct victim in its own right.
But despite the rhetorical power of the word ecocide, our sources highlight a massive, glaring legal void here. As of right now, ecocide is not an autonomous, standalone crime in the Rome Statute of the ICC.
Right. It's just not there.
I know Vanuatu, which is this Pacific island nation that is facing its own existential threats from rising sea levels, they actually submitted a formal proposal in 2024 to add ecocide as a fifth core crime to the Rome Statute.
They did. But currently, a prosecutor at The Hague cannot simply indict a military commander for the standalone crime of ecocide.
Because the Rome Statute is the primary treaty governing international criminal law, right?
Exactly. And because ecocide isn't a standalone crime, prosecutors are forced to try and fit this unprecedented environmental destruction into existing, much older legal frameworks.
It's not a total vacuum, but the path to a conviction is incredibly narrow.
Narrow is an understatement. The primary mechanism they have to rely on is Article 8, Paragraph 2, Section B, Subsection 4.
Let me break down the actual text of that article for everyone, because the phrasing here operates like a combination lock. Every single tumbler has to fall into place perfectly.
Go for it.
It criminalizes intentionally launching an attack in the knowledge that it will cause, and these are the exact words, widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment, which would be clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated.
The critical word in that first clause is "and." It is cumulative.
Widespread, and D long-term, and D severe.
Yes. And the definitions for these thresholds are completely daunting. Widespread typically implies an area on the scale of thousands of square kilometers.
Wow, okay.
Long-term is generally interpreted by legal scholars not in months or even a few years, but in decades. And severe means a massive, irreversible disruption to the ecosystem.
So if an artillery barrage obliterates a forest, and the damage is undeniably severe and it's widespread across a region, but scientific models show the forest might recover in 10 years instead of 30.
Then it fails the long-term test.
The combination lock doesn't open.
The lock stays shut, the charge fails.
That is so incredibly frustrating. And the first half of that clause is hard enough, but I want to focus on the second half. The damage must be clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated.
Right, the proportionality test.
I mean, doesn't that wording basically hand military commanders a massive gaping loophole?
It does. It introduces a totally subjective proportionality test.
Because a commander can just sit in a tribunal and say, well, yes, we blew up the dam. Yes, we knew it would flood 600 square kilometers and poison the Black Sea. But doing so halted an armored offensive that would have cost us the entire southern front.
And how does a prosecutor prove that the environmental damage was clearly excessive compared to losing a literal war?
Right. So prosecuting environmental destruction under the current Rome Statute sounds like trying to catch a great white shark using a butterfly net.
That is a perfect analogy. You've isolated the exact doctrinal obstacle that keeps international prosecutors awake at night. The modifier clearly is doing immense work there.
It really is.
It is designed to protect military commanders from being prosecuted for the inherent and unavoidable destruction of war, because secular international criminal law is built on establishing individualized culpability beyond a reasonable doubt.
You aren't putting a nation on trial. You are putting a specific general in the dock.
Therefore, the tribunal has to evaluate the mental state of that general at the precise moment the order was given.
They have to prove prospective knowledge.
Precisely. They have to prove what the general knew before pushing the button. It doesn't matter if a post-war environmental assessment proves that an entire river ecosystem is dead for a century. The prosecution must prove that the commander knew, based on the intelligence available at the time, exactly how catastrophic the long-term effects would be, and that this devastation unequivocally outweighed the military gain.
And the defense will just argue the fog of war.
Every time, they will say their intelligence was flawed, or they didn't anticipate the secondary industrial runoff, or that the military necessity of stopping an enemy advance was absolute.
So the high evidentiary thresholds of the Rome Statute functionally cripple the ability to prosecute these acts.
They really do. We are looking at a jurisdictional and evidentiary stalemate.
You have satellite imagery showing destruction on a biblical scale. Toxic soil, flooded cities, decimated forests. Yet the highest human courts are completely paralyzed. They're tripping over adjectives like clearly excessive and trying to define the exact temporal boundaries of long-term.
And if our human legal systems are struggling to even define the crime without offering military necessity as an escape hatch, we have to ask if we are operating in an ethical vacuum.
Right. But we are only in an ethical vacuum if we believe that human jurisprudence is the ultimate authority.
Which it is not. And this is exactly where our sources require us to look past The Hague and examine the transcendent framework of divine law.
Yes, because long before the Geneva Conventions, long before the Rome Statute, there was a legal framework that did not treat the natural environment merely as a disposable backdrop for human conflict.
This takes us into the book of Deuteronomy, specifically chapter 20, which contains the Sefer Milchama, the law of warfare.
And this was delivered by Moses around the 15th or 13th century BC, depending on the dating of the Exodus, right?
Correct. Right as the Israelites are on the plains of Moab, preparing to cross the Jordan River and begin a massive military campaign.
To understand the weight of what Moses is laying down here, we must reconstruct the geopolitical reality he was speaking into. The ancient Near East was a theater of absolute, unbridled destruction.
The concept of rules of engagement or proportionality just did not exist in the pagan military mind.
The sources mention the Neo-Assyrians. And when you read the royal annals of kings like Ishur-Nasirpal II or Tiglath-Pileser, it is chilling.
It's terrifying. They didn't just defeat an enemy army on the battlefield and accept a surrender.
No. They engaged in total, systemic, scorched earth warfare as a primary psychological and economic tactic. It wasn't collateral damage, it was the main event.
It was a flex of imperial dominance. The Assyrian kings would meticulously document their destruction of the land. They would salt agricultural fields.
And that wasn't a symbolic gesture, right?
Not at all. Salting the earth induces osmotic stress in the soil. It literally draws water out of plant roots and ensures that absolutely nothing can grow there for generations.
They would poison the drinking wells. They would systematically chop down ancient orchards and clear-cut forests.
The goal was to ensure that the conquered people, if any, even survived, could never reconstruct their economy.
But it was also deeply theological for them, wasn't it? The destruction of the land was this assertion that their pagan deity was superior to the local gods of the conquered territory.
Absolutely. Ancient Near Eastern warfare was a cosmic conflict. A nation's land was viewed as the domain of its patron deity.
Okay, so by turning an enemy's fertile valley into a barren wasteland, the conquering king was demonstrating that his gods, the gods of Assyria or Babylon, had utterly overpowered the local gods.
Yes, the environment was destroyed to honor the conqueror's pantheon.
Which makes the contrast with the law of Moses so staggering.
It is a night and day difference.
Moses is establishing a radically different foundation for how an army operates. Ancient warfare was brutally pragmatic, yet here is Moses setting hard limitations on environmental destruction thousands of years before the concept of international humanitarian law even existed.
Wait, ancient warfare was notoriously brutal. Are you saying Moses was establishing what we would now consider the first true rules of engagement regarding environmental protection?
I am. The foundational reasoning is what sets Israel apart. In the pagan mindset, a king claimed ownership of a territory by destroying it. But in the biblical framework, Yahweh declares absolute, unyielding ownership of the earth.
Right. Psalm 24 states it explicitly, "The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof."
God is the suzerain, the ultimate king, and the Israelites are merely his vassals. Therefore, human military power is strictly limited by the property rights of the Creator.
The destruction of the natural world, then, isn't just a violation of a human treaty, and it isn't just an unfortunate geopolitical tragedy.
No, it is a direct violation of the Creator's covenantal boundaries. You don't burn down your landlord's house to get at a squatter.
That is a great way to put it. God's moral laws regarding the care of creation are not suspended just because a war has started.
And this brings us to a really vital exegetical reality. We need to look at the specific language Moses uses, because it reveals the heart of divine jurisprudence on this issue.
The passage in question is Deuteronomy 20, verses 19 and 20, which specifically deals with the rules surrounding a siege.
And a siege is the perfect high-pressure environment to test a law like this. When an army surrounds a fortified city for months or even years, the supply lines stretch thin.
The soldiers are exhausted.
The commanders are frustrated. And the temptation to utilize every single available resource in the surrounding countryside and to vent that frustration through wanton destruction is overwhelming.
And in that exact context of heightened military desperation, Moses issues a definitive prohibition.
He says, "When you besiege a city for many days, you shall not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them."
Let's examine that word, destroy. Moses could have used a standard Hebrew verb for cutting or felling timber, like carrot. But he doesn't. He uses the verb shachat.
And the morphology here really matters. It's used in the hifil stem as tashchit.
The ifil stem in Hebrew makes the verb causative. It fundamentally means to spoil, to ruin, or to corrupt something to the point of uselessness.
So it carries a heavy moral resonance. It is not a neutral word for harvesting wood.
Exactly.
I was looking at the lexical connections across the Torah, and this just blew my mind. This exact same word, shachat, is the word used in Genesis chapter 6 to describe the state of the world right before the judgment of the flood.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, Genesis 6.2 says, "And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted." And there's the word, his shit, its way on the earth.
The implications of that lexical bridge are just immense. The moral corruption of humanity in Genesis 6 ruined the earth, triggering divine judgment.
By deliberately choosing shushat in the context of a military siege, Moses is categorizing scorched earth tactics as a manifestation of the very same wickedness that caused the flood.
He is elevating ecological destruction from a mere tactical choice to an act of profound, malicious vandalism against God's order.
He is tying military environmental destruction directly to the total depravity of man. And the text gets even more specific. It doesn't issue a blanket ban on touching any plant.
Right, it specifically protects what the Hebrew calls etz mahal, which translates to fruit-bearing tree.
The distinction between a fruit-bearing tree and a wild timber tree is vital to understanding the economic and human reality of the ancient Near East.
We are talking about trees like the olive tree, Olea europaea, or the date palm, or the fig tree. These were not ornamental landscaping. They were the absolute lifeblood of the agrarian economy.
An olive tree is a massive intergenerational investment. If you plant an olive shoot, it can take 10 to 15 years of careful cultivation and grafting just to start bearing a significant yield of fruit.
And it might take 50 years to reach its peak production.
And in that era, olive oil was everything. It was dense caloric energy. It was the fuel for their lamps. It was medicinal. It was used for ritual anointing.
So if a frustrated military commander orders his troops to clear-cut a valley of olive orchards during a siege, he is not merely depriving the current enemy soldiers of food.
He is effectively erasing the economic engine of that region for the next century.
He is imposing an intergenerational famine. He is stealing calories from grandchildren who have not even been born yet.
It is an act of short-sighted greed and ungodly revenge that ripples through time.
Which brings us to what I think is the rhetorical crux of the entire passage. It is this piercing, almost sarcastic question that Moses asks the Israelite army in verse 19.
He asks, "Is the tree of the field a human being that it should enter before you into the siege?"
That rhetorical question is the theological anchor of the entire prohibition. Moses is forcing the military commander to acknowledge a fundamental ontological distinction between human combatants and the natural environment.
Nature cannot take up arms. A river cannot sign a political alliance. An olive orchard cannot stage a rebellion.
They are non-combatants in the purest sense.
Therefore, subjecting the natural world to catastrophic military violence is deeply irrational. It is an act of displaced wrath.
You are punishing an innocent creation for the belligerence of fallen humans. It is an arrogant assumption that you have the right to take out your geopolitical frustrations on God's handiwork.
That makes total sense on a moral and theological level, but I have to put my military strategist hat on for a second.
Okay, let's play devil's advocate.
Let's imagine I am an Israelite commander. I hear Moses give this command, but I still have a fortified city in front of me that I have to conquer. Arrows are flying. Boiling oil is being prepared on the walls.
You need resources.
I need battering rams. I need to build siege towers. My men need campfires to survive the cold desert nights. If I cannot cut down trees, how on earth am I supposed to fight the war?
That's a fair question.
In the fog of battle, is a commander really going to send his men to painstakingly forage for the right kind of wood? Wouldn't they just chop down whatever is closest? How could Moses expect an army to enforce this?
Your pushback highlights exactly why divine law is so much more profound than human idealism. God's law isn't some hyper-utopian pacifist manifesto completely disconnected from the brutal realities of a fallen world.
Right.
It acknowledges the pragmatism of combat. In verse 20, Moses provides a very specific, actionable exception. He says, "Only the trees which you know are not food-bearing trees you may destroy and cut down and build siege works against the city."
So there is a clear, hard line drawn in the sand, but it requires incredible battlefield discipline.
It requires an army to maintain its moral compass even under fire. Yes, foraging for non-fruit-bearing timber like oak or cedar or wild scrub, well, it might take longer.
It might be way less convenient.
It forces the army to slow down, to assess their surroundings, and to exercise restraint. It demands that they operate not in a chaotic bloodlust, but with the disciplined recognition that they are fighting on God's property.
The law draws an absolute boundary between legitimate tactical necessity, building a siege tower from wild timber, and the wicked vandalism of destroying life-supporting ecosystems.
Exactly.
Let's pull this ancient boundary line forward and connect it to the modern era. We have to look at the intersection of Sinai, Geneva, and Kiev.
Because humanity has recognized the horror of environmental warfare, and we have tried to recreate this biblical standard.
We have tried to build human laws that replicate this divine restraint.
We have, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century. The catalyst for modern environmental protections in warfare was the Vietnam War.
The world watched the devastating long-term effects of chemical defoliants, primarily Agent Orange.
Right. The United States military sprayed millions of gallons of herbicides to strip away the jungle canopy and destroy agricultural crops.
And the ecological and human health consequences were catastrophic, and they literally persist to this day.
Because the dioxins in those defoliants bind to the soil and the food chain in ways very similar to the heavy metals we discussed earlier.
The international community realized they needed a modern equivalent to the Sefer Milchama. This led to significant treaties in the 1970s.
You have the 1977 Additional Protocol I to the 1949 Geneva Conventions, specifically Articles 35 and 55.
These articles mandate the protection of the national environment against, and here is that combination lock phrasing again, widespread, long-term, and severe damage.
You also have the 1976 ENMO Treaty, the Environmental Modification Convention. However, it's really critical to note the limitations of ENOD.
It was a product of Cold War anxieties, right?
Yeah. It specifically prohibits the hostile use of environmental modification techniques. Things like deliberately trying to trigger earthquakes, manipulating the weather, or steering hurricanes.
So it is much less applicable to standard kinetic warfare, like relentlessly shelling a forest or blowing up a conventional dam.
Right. What's fascinating in our sources, though, is the domestic legal situation in Ukraine itself.
While international law relies on these narrow treaties and high thresholds, Ukraine's own criminal code is far more robust. Article 441 of their code explicitly criminalizes ecocide.
Ukraine's domestic definition of ecocide is vastly broader than anything in the Rome Statute.
Article 441 covers the mass destruction of flora or fauna, the poisoning of air or water resources, and any other actions capable of causing an environmental disaster.
It strips away the impossible cumulative threshold of widespread, long-term, and severe. Most importantly, it completely eliminates the clearly excessive proportionality loophole.
So if you deliberately poison the water supply, it's ecocide, regardless of what military advantage you thought you were gaining.
Exactly.
But if their domestic law is so strong and the language is so clear, why is it so incredibly difficult to actually secure a conviction?
Because the evidentiary and logistical nightmare of conducting a forensic investigation in an active war zone is almost insurmountable.
Think about the mechanics of what a prosecutor must prove to a judge. Environmental damage is highly cumulative, especially in a heavily industrialized nation like Ukraine.
So if a river is polluted, a defense attorney will just argue that the pollution was already there before the war started.
Exactly. Ukraine was a massive industrial hub during the Soviet era. There was legacy pollution everywhere.
A prosecutor has to scientifically prove exactly how much of the current toxicity in a river is the direct result of a specific Russian artillery strike on a chemical plant on a specific Tuesday versus a damaged municipal wastewater system versus decades of pre-war industrial runoff.
How do they even do that? I mean, how do you separate the pollution?
It requires advanced hydrological modeling and isotopic tracing. Scientists literally have to look at the isotopic signatures of the heavy metals to differentiate between a 1980s Soviet factory leak and the residue of a modern Kh-22 cruise missile.
And they have to do this while gathering water and soil samples under active artillery fire?
Yes, they have to maintain an absolutely unbroken chain of custody for those samples, from a frontline trench all the way to a laboratory in Kyiv or The Hague.
And then they have to link that specific isotopic evidence to the specific intent or knowledge of the military commander who ordered the strike.
It's mind-blowing, and even if you manage that impossible forensic feat, you still need the actual perpetrator in custody.
Which brings me to a major cynical pushback here.
Let's hear it.
If the ICC cannot touch top officials because of jurisdictional limits and veto powers, and Ukraine's domestic Article 441 is hindered by sovereign immunity, meaning it is nearly impossible to put a foreign head of state or a top general on trial in a domestic court, isn't this entire conversation about ecocide just a symbolic branding exercise? Are we just inventing fancy new words for old atrocities that we are fundamentally powerless to punish?
Functionally, your cynicism is pretty justified regarding the immediate hurdles of criminal trials. Sovereign immunity is a massive roadblock.
Yeah.
However, the label of ecocide is not merely symbolic. It serves a crucial purpose in establishing what legal scholars call an expressive norm.
It declares to the international community that this behavior is categorically abhorrent, shifting the baseline of acceptable conduct.
But pragmatically, you are right. In a courtroom setting, prosecutors often find more success dropping the politically charged ecocide label entirely and prosecuting the environmental destruction as the factual dimension of older, more established war crimes.
Crimes that are already thoroughly embedded in the jurisprudence, like what?
Like the war crime of pillage, or excessive incidental harm to civilians, or the unlawful destruction of property not justified by military necessity.
Property crimes.
Yes. If an invading army clear-cuts a massive national forest, they aren't just destroying an ecosystem. They are unlawfully seizing and destroying public property and natural resources.
Sometimes, approaching the environmental damage through the lens of traditional property laws or civilian harm makes the evidentiary burden slightly more manageable.
There is also a distinct move away from purely criminal accountability toward financial accountability. If you can't put a general in a cell, you make the state pay for the damage.
Yes, the focus expands to state responsibility. The Council of Europe has actually established a register of damage for Ukraine.
And their mandate is not to prepare criminal indictments, but to painstakingly document the ecological and infrastructural loss.
They are quantifying the destruction so that in a future international compensation process, the frozen sovereign assets of the aggressor state might be legally seized and used to pay for the environmental restoration.
It's a pragmatic workaround. But even with all of these mechanisms, the property laws, the isotopic tracing, the compensation registers, there is a lingering, heavy sense of inadequacy.
Human law, even when pursued with the best forensic science and the noblest intentions, is fragile.
It is subject to UN Security Council vetoes. It is hindered by the fog of war.
And it's subject to the agonizing reality that sometimes the worst perpetrators of these crimes die comfortably in their beds, having never seen the inside of a courtroom.
Which is precisely why our sources drive us toward a theological conclusion. They demand that we shift our focus from the limitations of human jurisprudence to the reality of redemptive history and the promise of ultimate accountability.
Right. And the hermeneutical key here is that every Old Testament law, every shadow, and every physical restriction finds its ultimate purpose and fulfillment in the redemptive work of Christ.
So how do we draw the line from Deuteronomy 20, the law protecting the fruit trees during a siege, to this ultimate Christological fulfillment?
It connects directly through the stark contrast between the fallen earthly rulers who ravaged the earth and the ultimate ruler who redeems it.
You look at history, from Ashurnasirpal II in ancient Assyria to modern dictators unleashing floods and poisoning soil. They exercise dominion by destroying the earth to display their power and secure their empires.
Then you have Christ, who is described in Isaiah as the Prince of Peace. His eschatological reign, as described in Revelation 21.5, is not about the annihilation of the physical cosmos.
He says, "Behold, I am making all things new." He subdues the earth not to destroy it, but to renew it, to lift the curse from it.
And there is a beautiful, almost poetic connection embedded in the trees themselves.
Yes. The protected fruit-bearing tree in Deuteronomy, the Etz Makal, is a sustainer of life. It prefigures Christ himself.
In the Gospel of John, chapter 15, Christ explicitly calls himself the true vine, the ultimate source of spiritual sustenance.
And in Revelation 22, in the vision of the New Jerusalem, we see the tree of life restored, spanning the river, yielding its fruit every month, and its leaves are for the healing of the nations.
While fallen humans are out there chopping down orchards in the madness of war, generating intergenerational famine, Christ stands as the ultimate tree of life, generating intergenerational healing.
And there's a deeply visceral connection to the physical environment in the crucifixion itself. In Genesis 3, when humanity rebelled, the ground itself was cursed.
The text says it will produce thorns and thistles. The environment was fractured by human sin.
And when Christ went to the cross to bear the penalty for that sin, what did the Roman soldiers place on his head?
A crown of thorns.
It is a stunning theological detail. Christ physically bore the botanical manifestation of creation's curse upon his own skull.
The environment, corrupted by the fall, was literally weaponized against him by the military of his day.
And he took that physical corruption upon himself in order to redeem not just human souls, but the entire physical cosmos.
Romans 8 tells us that the creation itself groans, waiting to be liberated from its bondage to decay.
That is a profound framework. It changes entirely how you view the physical earth. And this leads to the ultimate enforcement of that ancient law in Deuteronomy.
Human courts at the Hague might fail. Jurisdictions might stall. But the sources point us to a specific terrifying verse regarding the final judgment, Revelation 11.19.
It is perhaps the most chilling and precise verse in the New Testament regarding the theology of environmental warfare.
The context of Revelation 11 is the sounding of the seventh trumpet, the arrival of the final judgment.
And the verse declares that the time has come to judge the dead, to reward the prophets, and listen to this final clause, to destroy those who destroy the earth.
I was looking at the Greek text for this, and the lexical connection is astounding. It bridges the Old and New Testaments perfectly.
It really does.
The Greek verb used in Revelation 11.18 for destroy or corrupt is diaphtero. If you go back and look at the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, that is the exact same Greek word used to translate the Hebrew word shaichad in Deuteronomy 20.
When Moses says, "Do not destroy the trees," the Septuagint uses diaphtero.
The linguistic thread runs straight from the dusty plains of Moab to the eschatological climax of human history.
The promise of Revelation is absolute. Wanton ecological destruction is not merely a secular crime. It is a profound sin against the Creator, and it will incur absolute divine judgment.
The very same word is used to describe the crime and the punishment. Those who corrupt God's earth will be corrupted.
So, to put this in perspective, secular international law, the ICC, the Rome Statute, the Geneva Conventions, these are essentially common grace institutions.
They reflect the remnants of God's moral order inscribed on the human conscience. They recognize that wantonly destroying a river or a forest is fundamentally wrong.
But because they are human institutions, they are functionally broken by political maneuvering, high evidentiary thresholds, and jurisdictional limits.
They are a butterfly net trying to catch a leviathan. But Revelation 11.18 acts as the ultimate cosmic Supreme Court.
There are no jurisdictional stalemates there. The fog of war is pierced by omniscience.
There are no UN Security Council vetoes before the judgment seat of Christ.
That is the exact framework we must hold. Human courts are pedagogical. They are teaching tools that point to what is right and attempt to restrain evil, but they are inherently imperfect instruments of justice.
The divine court is inescapable.
So what does this synthesis of theology, history, and jurisprudence mean for us today? How do we apply this massive framework to the reality of the physical world we are watching burn on the evening news?
It requires a synthesis that leads to action and perspective. First, it demands clear, uncompromising moral condemnation.
When we look at the destruction in Ukraine, the Kakhovka Dam washing pollutants into the sea, the chemical sterilization of the black soil, we must categorize these actions accurately.
We cannot merely write them off as tactical blunders or secular infractions of a treaty. Under the biblical framework, they are high treason against the Creator's design.
But in making that condemnation, our sources are very careful to warn against swinging the pendulum too far in the opposite direction. There are two extremes we have to avoid here.
Right. On one side, you have the ruthless, utilitarian destruction of the earth for human power, the scorched earth warfare of Ashurbanipal and modern dictators.
The earth is treated as nothing more than raw material to be exploited or destroyed for tactical gain.
But on the other side, you have the rising secular ideology of deep ecology, or what the sources term eco-idolatry.
This is the mindset that essentially views humanity as a virus, a blight on the planet. It elevates nature above human life.
The Apostle Paul talks about this in Romans 1, describing the fundamental human error of worshiping the creation rather than the Creator.
Exactly. Both of those extremes fail entirely to recognize the proper covenantal relationship between humanity and the environment.
The biblical standard is found in the creation mandate of Genesis 1.28, true creation stewardship. Humanity is indeed called to exercise dominion over the earth.
But dominion in the biblical sense is not tyranny. Humans are placed in the garden as vassal kings, tasked with developing, managing, and protecting God's world with wisdom, care, and absolute obedience to the ultimate owner.
True stewardship rejects the pantheistic environmentalism that would elevate the life of a tree above the life of a human being, but it fiercely rejects the military utilitarianism that treats intricate ecosystems as disposable assets.
Practically, this means we can and should support human legal efforts to restrain evil.
We should support initiatives like the European Union's 2024 Environmental Crime Directive, which seeks to create tougher, more enforceable penalties for ecological destruction.
We can observe proposals like Vanuatu's push to add Ecocide to the Rome Statute with interest, hoping that it creates stronger common grace restraints on human malice.
We pursue these legal avenues because God loves justice. But we do so with sober expectations, recognizing their inherent limitations.
We fight for justice in human courts. We utilize isotopic tracing in international tribunals, but we do so knowing that true, unshakable legal authority rests solely in the sovereign law of God.
The enforcement void in international law is a painful reality, but it is a temporary one. This has been a truly expansive deep dive. We started with the staggering physical reality of the Kakhovka Dam breach, 18 cubic kilometers of water unleashed as a weapon, fundamentally altering the geography of a nation.
We navigated the complex, frustrating legal labyrinths of The Hague, discovering how a combination lock of words like clearly excessive and long-term can tie the hands of international prosecutors trying to hold commanders accountable for ecocide.
We traveled back thousands of years to the ancient battlefields of Moab, where Moses established an unyielding divine law against punishing the creation for human belligerence, asking that profound, piercing question, is the tree a human being?
And finally, we looked forward to the eschatological promise of a restored creation, where the ultimate judge promises to permanently destroy those who destroy the earth.
It is a sweeping narrative that connects the chemical composition of the soil beneath our feet to the highest courts of both human and divine justice.
It really is.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week. When you look at the news today and you see scorched earth, ruined crops, or bombed infrastructure, or even when you just look at the natural world around your own home, consider this. What if our inability to fully prosecute these catastrophic acts in human courts isn't just a sign that our political systems are broken?
What if that frustration is actually a profound, constant reminder that ultimate justice was never meant to be fully realized by human hands alone?
How does knowing that a final, inescapable accounting is coming change the way you view and care for the physical world right outside your window today?